or friends, because sometimes the line of thinking is, if I need to go to a professional, will that person judge me? Will that person think that I am crazy? Um, when we've talked on Sunday mornings, we also highlighted the issue of stigma around, if I pray, do I still need to go to therapy? And if I go to therapy, does that mean that I don't have enough faith? What I would also like to highlight tonight, which we may not as always talk about, are that there are real barriers that exist outside of a person feeling stigma. Accessibility is a challenge. It can be socioeconomic barriers. Even though many people do have commercial insurance, it does not cover mental health services 100%. There's not full parity between physical health and mental health care. There's also the reality of culturally competent care. And oftentimes, individuals in the Black and Brown community do not experience the level of dignity and respect in a mental health process where people are vulnerable and talking about their issues. And it's truly important that what Black and Brown individuals describe, and often describe mental health concerns in physical terms, that it be recognized as a mental health concern as opposed to some other, just a physical ailment or something that can be treated quickly and moved along.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, First Lady. There are a couple of things that I noted as you were sharing, one of which you talk about accessibility. We have pushed the idea, we've continued to undergird this movement around your mental health is your health. Your mental health is your health. But the reality is that it is not covered in the same way where our physical health coverage is covered. And so for those that are joining us, for our friends and family, one of the things that we want you to think through as you're going around now and re-enrolling for your healthcare plans is that you take note of plans that afford you opportunities to be able to see a culturally competent, licensed mental health practitioner where the healthcare company will be able to cover some of the costs. So we want to talk about accessibility. But First Lady, can you talk a little bit more about cultural competence in terms of care for the Black and Brown community? And then we're going to pivot a little bit to talk more specifically about Black males. So tell us a little bit about the issue around competency, cultural competency in care.
Sure. As I said previously, respect and dignity is really very important. And oftentimes individuals in the Black and Brown community report feeling that everything that they do day to day, myself included, sometimes feels like an effort. So in terms of interaction between not only mental health providers, just healthcare providers, in general, it is really important for an individual who's seeking care to feel comfortable, to feel that it is a safe space, to feel that they have the opportunity to be able to fully express the range of symptoms, to not be rushed, and that those symptoms be properly vetted. Much research has shown that there may be misconceptions about how Black and Brown individuals experience pain, how we discuss our mental health concerns, and whether or not the emphasis on those physical symptoms lead only to medical diagnoses, or the fact that spiritual and faith interventions are really important to Black and Brown individuals. Generally speaking, that may sometimes be seen as an individual not being ready to actually have the medical or mental health treatment or intervention. So it really takes a provider who is open, a provider who is engaging, and a provider who wants to learn, who asks the right questions in order to really understand and vet what is a person experiencing, and then walking the individual through the appropriate amount of education so that patient can make a good decision about what would be the care path they would like to take together with the healthcare provider.
Thank you. Thank you, First Lady. I want to acknowledge those that are joining us online, that you can go in and type your questions in or comments in. We'll be able to pull some of those up on the screen. We can see it in a live time. If you're on YouTube, if you're on Facebook, come in and be a part of the discussion. I want to acknowledge Sister Donna Fox that joined us. But Brother Nathaniel Spalding, when you were talking about cultural competency in care as it relates to Black and Brown communities, he typed in trust, that there is something that is inherited as a part of our culture, not to trust the majority culture. And so when we get to the place where we're seeking help, at least in terms of mental health, there's an issue of trust that comes in, whether or not you trust the person that's going to provide you with care, whether or not you trust that they understand your cultural background, and the way that the cultural communication and cultural interactions. I don't want to wait any longer, First Lady. I want you to stay right there,
Sure.
but I want to invite to the screen right now, as I shared on Sunday, that before I knew what best friends are, this brother was my best friend. Before we understood the brotherhood and growing into self, I met this brother when I was 10 years old. Amen. 10 years old. We sat next to each other in our first class in high school. And so that you know the context, those that are in the United States, high school in Jamaica starts in 7th grade, which is first form for us. So I have known this brother for 35 years. We go a long way. And so let me invite Dr. Geoffrey Walcott to the platform this evening. Welcome, my brother. Welcome.
My brother, thank you.
Welcome. Let me tell them a little bit more about you, Geoffrey, before you jump in. Dr. Walcott. Dr. Walcott is the clinical director of Psychotherapy Associates Limited there in Jamaica. This brother is doing phenomenal work as it relates to psychotherapy, clinical work, psychiatry, training, development, not only in Jamaica, but across the Caribbean and across the world. I did a quick internet search of him, and he's all over, from Harvard University to New Jersey, doing work across the Caribbean. And so we're excited to have you. Welcome, Dr. Walcott.
Thank you, my brother. It's very exciting to be here with you, you know. That would go back 20 or 15 years. I don't know how you throwing me under the bus with the 35 years. we got a safe face.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I know that there's some of our classmates. I know that at least one is watching us tonight. We are fellow classmates from Clarendon College in Jamaica. So we want to big up the Clarendon College crew. Amen. I didn't stay long enough to Clarendon College to graduate because my family migrated to the States, but I claim Clarendon College as my roots. Let me jump in this, Dr. Walcott, Reverend Carla. I saw a quote today that I want to share, and the quote is from a poet, Princeton Powell. And the quote says, "Being a Black man in America means being my brother's keeper while keeping a distance from my brother because I don't trust him further than I can see him. It is believing that the cops don't care about you. It's learning how to doubt yourself because before you were born, everybody else doubted you." And so tonight's discussion, we want to double down on this idea, this conversation around Black men's mental health and what it means for us post-pandemic, if we really can say that, or as we're navigating these changing times. So Dr. Walcott, why don't you share with us a little bit about what you have seen and experienced in the work that you do around providing services support to Black men?
Okay, so I think one of the things to say is, first, I'm a psychiatrist, but the majority of the work that I actually do is heavily on psychology and psychotherapy, because a lot of the challenges that we actually deal with have to do with resilience and the lack of resilience in dealing with the challenges that most people face. Issues of how to be self-sustaining in a society that is geared towards keeping you in a state of poverty and in a state of dependency. And that's some of the greatest challenges that you have to focus on. And what we've been doing, especially the last 10 years of my life, really has been focused on primary prevention rather than actual treatment, focusing on developing programs for children, for adolescents. One such program we actually implemented at our old alma mater recently over the past 5 years, with the kids using the sports as a template for the football program as a template to actually get these young guys to learn how to have pro-social skills, how to interact with groups, and how to be self-determinant in terms of their own sense of self and identity, and recognize the power that they have within themselves. And I think that's pretty much where my life's work has really taken me these days. And it's not so much an issue of treatment, because most of the treatment issues we've really dealt with. And I have a recent paper published in the APA journal, Psychiatric Services, on the psychiatric treatment issues, which we've been doing using community approaches, which is the same thing that we focus on now, which is strengthening communities and empowering the community to be actually the crucible for health, rather than taking it to an individual's office or a psychologist. Because even in the best countries with the most resources, there will never be enough specialists to deal with the mental health challenges of the population.
Dr. Walcott, you've just said so much, right? And so I need to back out a little bit, brother, and come back in. For sake of this discussion tonight, as you are kind of building the foundation for the presentation that you're about to give, you made it clear that you are a psychiatrist practicing psychology, right? And so for our audience tonight, we're not going to assume that everybody knows. Can you talk to us a little bit about the difference between psychiatry and psychology?
Okay, so psychiatry is a medical discipline, and it focuses more on the biological aspect of mental health challenges and disorders. And we're usually, the first thing that comes to mind is that we use pharmaceutical agents as the mainstay of our treatment, as well as inpatient care and inpatient treatment. Psychologists are behavioral specialists. In other words, they focus on restructuring the social environment so that you can have transformation in behavioral patterns that are negative or that are counterproductive. So what used to happen in the field is that there's a separation. So the psychiatrist would gravitate towards the medical and biological aspect, and then we would just refer to the psychologist. But what we've realized is that it's hard to actually separate those two issues, because a lot of the mental health disorders and the dysfunction that you're seeing are rooted in social dysfunction and family dysfunction from early on. And so for us to stop seeing the end result, we have to start focusing on addressing the issues earlier and providing the support and structure that is needed. And in fact, even in therapy, because a dear friend of mine, Dixon Chaibanda from Zimbabwe, who is the president of the African Mental Health Research Initiative, had developed a program using grandmothers to treat depression in Zimbabwe as a part of the therapeutic milieu. And so the concept of mental illness and mental treatment being this divorced entity where a person in a white coat sits and dictates to you what you should or should not be doing is something that we're moving away from, and realizing that the essence of mental wellness has to do with community and community connection. It is a focus.
And I think thank you for saying that, Dr. Walcott, because that is the driving force behind the work we do in our faith community, is to say to not only our immediate community that worships with us on a weekly basis, but also to the general community, that the faith community, the church, can serve as a social agent, a community agent, to be able to address the issues of mental health within our community. So thank you for saying that the work now is being doubled down on looking at the social dysfunctions that lead to some of this, but not only that, but also the family dynamics. And so I want to talk a little bit about the family dynamics. I know you have a presentation that I'm trying to gear up for, so that you can share this with the audience. We want to talk a little bit about family dynamics as it relates to and impact mental health, but also social dysfunctions, right? So we live in a society, we live in the United States, you're in the Caribbean, and some things are similar, some things are different, right? We deal with issues of racism, structural racism, systematic racism. There are isms within the community across the Caribbean. And I can say that because I'm from the Caribbean, I lived in the Caribbean, and I've traveled internationally to Africa. I know that some of the same issues exist. And so talk to us a little bit about some of the social dysfunctions, and then, brother, I'm going to open up for you to do the presentation.
Right. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because the impact of colonization and slavery may vary from the different countries that exist based on development and structure that exists, but you have an underlying and underpinning element that is still there, and that is the lack of empowerment of those that were enslaved in the New World. It is rampant throughout the cultural context. And if you look, especially in Caribbean, Latin American countries, you realize, for example, that we are some of the most violent countries in the world, yet we have some of the most endearing, loving, and caring people. And so the paradox is there. And when we actually looked at these behavioral parameters within the society and identified the presence of these maladaptive behavioral patterns, and they actually followed three main threads. It was one, the issue of pathological dependency and entitlement, psychosexual perversion and psychosexual distress, and authority conflict and skewed power management systems. And all of those three elements can be directly correlated back to the social engineering practices from slavery and colonization. So it's important to recognize that even though there is differences, the underpinning and the underlying core pathology has still permeated our society. And some of us have been able to overcome it more than others, but it still acts as a crucible of transgressive behavioral patterns that exist in the different countries as they are.
Brother, you just said a mouthful for me when we talk about those three patterns, right? And I want to come back to that. I'm going to bring First Lady back. So First Lady, prepare yourself because we want to talk about some of those patterns that has led to some of the dysfunction that we see in our community. But Dr. Walcott, I'm going to go ahead and pull the presentation up. As you can see, my brothers and sisters that's joining us in our social media world, this brother is well versed in this. I remember back maybe 25 years ago, Geoffrey, coming to visit you at UWI when you were in medical school and studying. And sitting in your dorm room and talking to you, and I am just so excited, brother, for the work that you have been doing across the Caribbean. And so, talk to us about this psychological consequences that have led Black men facing in the Caribbean, and specifically in Jamaica, and what you're doing about it. And I'm going to go ahead and add it right there. There you go. Go ahead and talk with us, brother.
All right, so what I want to look at is some of the factors that influence mental health of young Black men in Jamaica. And the issue of youth in itself is a problematic issue, because worldwide, in every culture, ages 15 to 25, which represents a large segment of the population, tends to be the most at-risk group for either becoming victims or perpetrators of violence, issues of substance abuse, HIV, AIDS infection, and motor vehicle accidents. And the reality of this is that this is probably one of the most vulnerable groups because of the biology. When you look at brain development, we often think that we are 20 years ago that the brain developed at age 2 and didn't change. And we now know that that's not true. Actual brain development continues up until age 20, 25. And the area of the brain that develops later is the part that is responsible for what we call high cognitive functioning or judgment. It is that area of the brain that separates childhood thinking from adult thinking. But in most cultures, especially in suppressive cultures with elements of racism, Black men in particular are not allowed, they are not afforded the luxury of youthful exuberance because the system sees them as adults and judges them on their actions as grown-ups from the age of 10, 11, or 12. And so this is a huge difficulty. So if you're looking at this group in particular as the most vulnerable, and I think it was Gandhi that said that the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. And when you look at the business of mental health care in particular, you realize that there's a huge problem, especially in the colonized or post-colonial world. And Frantz Fanon mentioned that you cannot really look at mental health issues without exploring the sociocultural context with which it comes out of, because you're assuming that the society itself is not pathological. And that, as we have learned from history, is a very wrong assumption. Because when you look, for example, at Jamaica particularly, our indigenous people, the Taino Indians, and Las Casas, a Spanish monk, had chronicled with great detail how the society was structured. those societies were structured based on inclusivity and community principles. And in fact, when you look at how they cared for their mentally ill, it was in a communal setting in a way that amazed the Europeans to the point where they thought it was due to some form of witchcraft. But they were using empathetic and humanistic methodologies to care for persons in the community because they viewed the community as responsible for the individual and not the other way around. But our country has a long history of conflict, colonial conflict with Britain, following the slave trade and colonization up until 1962. And one of the clear result of this is the business of slavery, which most people misunderstand as a way of labor exploitation, but it was much more than that. Slavery was an instituted system of social engineering, where society was engineered by brutality, trauma, cruelty, and fear, and where blacks were considered 3/5 humans. And they were rated for absolute subservience to whites with skewed authority master-servant relations. And the main objective of slavery was for absolute sexual and vocational exploitation. So it was a psychosocial engineered system that was meant to transform not only the behavioral pattern, the thinking pattern, but every aspect of the enslaved lives. And it was Frantz Fanon that said that colonization in its essence is not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form and content. By a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it. And it is one of the ultimate essence of control by brutality. And this gentleman, Galton, when he did a wonderful paper in the journal in 1969 and looked at the business of violence, and he articulated that there were several components to violence. There was a business of structural violence, where the action is built into the structures or systems of a society that show up as unequal power and unequal life chances, unequal distribution of resources, and the unequal distribution of power to decide over the distribution of those resources. And those are built on the platform of cultural violence. And cultural violence is the aspect of the symbolic sphere, the culture of a society that is used to justify or legitimize direct or structural violence on a particular group of individuals. And in the post-colonial or post-slavery society, you can identify that the ultimate cultural violence that was initiated on our people on a whole, that led to the structural violence and some of the direct violence we see, was this particular issue, that Black people were considered less than human. The dehumanization of any group can lead to and justify atrocities that are committed without cause or consequences. And part of the issue, not just in terms of the cultural violence, is the fact that a lot of the systems and structures that were created that you would assume were able to provide upliftment were not designed to do that for Black people. The education system, and I think this book by Philip Sherlock and Hazel Bennett spoke to it clearly, that the colonial system of education bred a lack of self-confidence among Blacks in their own ability to manage their own affairs. So already you're seeing some of the tenets coming out in terms of power and authority mismanagement and the misunderstanding of what authority actually means. And of course, the establishment of forced dependency and the negation of one's ability to be self-sufficient in the society. And Carl Stone identified the areas with which most of these core values are entrenched. And one of the main ones, as you recognize, is the school or the education system, but also the church, the family, and the workplace. And these were some of the main agencies of social transformation. And so they could either perpetuate the pathology that exists in the society, or they could act as the fulcrum for societal change. And I'll get to in the latter half of the presentation how we've been using some of these as the fulcrum for societal change. Ivan Illich said that school is an advertising agency which makes you believe that you need the society as it is. And all of this is focused on the element and the issue of control and negation. In our society, we recognize, and I think this is probably one of the greatest myths that we ever come across, that persons who are involved in crime are somehow incapable of succeeding in educational system. When we looked at persons condemned for murder, we found that 15% of them had IQ scores in the superior to very superior range, which was double that of the normal population. So the issue is, how is it that these brilliant young men end up in prison and are not able to find better alternatives to enrich their lives or to make a better life for themselves? And we also found that a lot of these young men suffered from what was termed at the time personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder. When you look at the statistics from 2013, and Jamaica is one of, as I said before, one of the most murderous countries in the world, the age group from 16 to 25, the number of persons arrested for murder within that age group is greater than all other age groups combined. And this pattern is similar all over the world. And one of the things that was pointed to was, and Herbert Gale did a beautiful paper that he took a lot of flack on, was that the main driving force was the hostility and toxicity of the home environment. And he pointed to the fact that the abuse of boys by mothers and absent fathers provided a whole different psychopathology. But for the murders in particular, it was the abuse of boys by their mothers in a system that is entrenched to devalue them as it is. And so it was a complex societal fact that we had to grapple with, that our concept of discipline and abuse were somehow warped, and we had to rethink that. And so recently there's a lot of work that has come out in terms of what happens to children and how it impacts their adult life. The prevailing thought now is that it's not what's wrong with the child, but really what has happened to them. And that has led to the publication of various studies on these things called adverse childhood experiences and how they impact not just mental health, but also physical health. And some of these factors you can look at are community or environmental factors. Some you can relate to in terms of poor housing quality and affordability, lack of opportunity, economic mobility and stagnation, lack of social capital, violence within the community, community disruption, discrimination and poverty, and leading to homes or households that are either in financial difficulty, homelessness, the presence of domestic violence, substance abuse, incarceration of family members, mental illness within the family, emotional and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, or divorce, broken family homes, and very particularly the concept of maternal depression, which is not often recognized, especially in our Black women. And what happens to children who are traumatized? And Judith Herman spoke about the fact that when a child goes through high levels of trauma, especially when it comes in an environment that they expect to be safe, from someone that they expect to be protected, a very peculiar thing happens to the psyche of that child, because the child develops a contaminated, almost stigmatized identity. The child victim takes the evil of the abuser into themselves, thereby preserving the primary attachment to their abuser, because the innocence of badness preserves a relationship. It is not readily given up even after the abuse has stopped. Rather, it becomes a stale part of the child's personality structure. And too often we see kids who are behaving in a maladaptive way, who are doing things that they ought not to, and not recognizing that the child's internalization of breaking the rule, of doing this, is a way of normalizing a sense of control because they have been through trauma. And it was Fred Hickling and Gerard Hutchison that identified that the main way to negate a lot of this psychic trauma and challenges is through the business of cultural control and the ability to culturally validate themselves in modes of expression that range from religion to music, and that this has been protective in dealing with psychic challenges throughout history. And so we developed a program that was based on cultural transformation and social re-engineering. And we administered this program to children in Jamaican schools as well as the community who had issues with both academic performance and behavioral performance, using the culture as a vehicle for delivering the therapeutic modality. And you talk about stigmatization. If we had gone into these schools and say we're doing a psychiatric or psychological program, it would have gotten nowhere. So the program was couched as a resiliency development program. It was called Cultural Resiliency, Humoral Cultural Resiliency Program. And so the premise is, in our communities, we expect our young people to become employed, develop jobs, go through existing structures, get qualification and either migrate or become part of the workforce. But we had to recognize that the at-risk children needed greater intervention, and we needed to use the cultural therapies at various stages of life, including early childhood, prepubescence, adolescence, and young adulthood, to change the behavioral aspect of the child so that they could develop new skills and divert them to a pathway of productivity and mental wellness. And this is critical because productivity and mental wellness are not separate issues. Mental disorders, if you look at all of them in context, are really disorders of social and societal functionality. That's where the greatest impairment occurs. And so the cultural therapy premise negated some of the cultural violence that was expressed in our community by teaching these children how to work together, how to control their impulses, how to perform, how to organize, how to manage authority, and how to develop a sense of self. Those were the mental health tools that these children needed, and that they needed to excel in the environment that they were in. And it was about negating the essence of the cultural violence that has been perpetuated on our people throughout all of the colonial world, post-colonial world. And that is establishing what Marcus Garvey had spoken about, that the black skin is not a badge of shame, but rather a glorious symbol of national greatness. That is the vision that we've been on, and that is the course that we have taken. So I thank you very much, my brother, and I will go back to the discussion because I don't want to take up too much time. I think the discourse is more important.
My brother, you just unloaded a full doctoral course on us. The chat is jumping, and so I'm going to get on a couple of things. We are, folks are viewing from all over the world, Dr. Walcott, Reverend Carla, and so we want to get in as many people as possible in terms of comments. And so there are a couple of things that you mentioned. I want to go back, Dr. Walcott, in the beginning when you start talking about the three. What are those things that before you started the presentation, you talk about the three things. I want you to elaborate on that for us a little bit more. And then I'm going to get to a question from Sister Barbara Irvin that asks a question. It is rooted in faith and our religious belief, but I'm going to ask the question and we're going to tackle it a little bit. So Walcott, just share with us again those three areas that you believe are serving as a foundation for some of the dysfunction that we see, and let's jump into a conversation.
Right. So what we had done was to analyze a large group of the society that were having difficulty in terms of their adaptive skills that would have been diagnosed with things like personality disorder. And what we found when we took apart all of the symptoms was that there was a cluster of three main issues that came up, right? The first and the most significant one was the business of power management. These people were unable to recognize what healthy power structures were like. They were either oppressive to persons who were subservient to them, or they were conflictual with persons in authority, and they used techniques like passive-aggressive resistance. They were always in this discord with persons around them. They were vindictive. They were undermining. They were sabotaging in terms of their engagement, and these were people who also were exploitive and oppressive to persons that they were in authority over. And a lot of it stemmed from impulse problems, impulse control issues. And in the very severe cases, you actually had high levels of violence. And in particular, domestic violence was a core factor that came out of that group. And so that is one arm that we looked at and where the symptoms clustered. The other area that it clustered was actually with dependency. And this is a very interesting thing that happened, because what we found was that socioeconomic status did not impact the prevalence of dependency. So you had persons who were dependent on all the different socioeconomical scales, whether they were lower class, middle class, or upper class. They were still dependent because they inculcated a sense of entitlement. They were willing to do what was necessary for their own benefit because they expected others to do it. And that also fed into the conflict and into the discord that you had. The third element was a little bit controversial, but the reality is that it is what the evidence shows. The psychosexual issues were a part of the problem. There was high level of duplicity. And when Fred Hickling, my late mentor, did the presentation, and he said, and I quote him, because he took a lot of fire for it, and he said that the business of enough girl syndrome is a mental illness. And he took a lot of flack for it, because
so Geoffrey, for my Caribbean audience, understood exactly what you just said, but because
I'll break it down.
Break it down for us, brother.
It is a multiple partner syndrome, and it's not just multiple partners, because there are relationship patterns where you have like polyamorous relationship, which are not pathological. It is the duplicity, it is the lying and the deception to maintain the multiple partner relationship. And the other aspect also came out in regards to sexual orientation. Now that's always a huge keg or hotbed of issues, because what came out was ego dystonic sexual orientation, and therefore it didn't reflect on the issue of persons who were either homosexual or heterosexual, but those persons who were engaged in sexual acts that were not in keeping with their sexual orientation. And that goes for both ways, because I've had a patient who, in terms of her sexual orientation, she was lesbian, LGBTQ oriented, but she was involved in heterosexual relations, which she was using as a transactional modality. And so it is the disconnect between their true sexual orientation and their sexual practices that actually fuel a lot of the conflict and discord, and the inability to actually connect sexually with intimacy. So sexual act was usually seen as a transaction or a chore rather than a way of bonding or connecting with persons. And so when you put all of these together, these patterns of behavior, and in fact, the sexual act is usually used as an exploitative tool or a controlling tool. And so all of these come together, you recognize, and you see when we talk about the social engineering patterns of slavery. Slavery was about engineering a skewed authority relationship where violence was seen as discipline, where the slaves were forced into a state of dependency, where all aspects of their lives were controlled by the slave owners, and where sex and sexual activity was seen as a transactional methodology by either coercion, force, or ways and means of avoiding punishment. So all of these patterns that we currently see in our society had clear outlining roots into a lot of what happened during the social reengineering practices of slavery.
Thank you, Dr. Walcott. One of the questions that I had written for tonight for our discussion was for us to describe how the Black men's mental health is challenged by racism. And I think you did just a phenomenal job building us up around looking at slavery, colonization, and how it has impacted us just in terms of a society, but how it has impacted us as individuals. Let me address a question that was asked by evangelist Barbara Irvin, and I'm going to take a different look at this, Sister Barbara. Sister Barbara asked, as you were talking about some of the foundational issues, some of the dysfunctions, Dr. Walcott, is the root cause due to generational curses, right? And oftentimes I know I'm going to handle this, Geoffrey, because I'm I'm going to handle this part. I know my friend well. Oftentimes we try to put religious terms on some structures that we don't necessarily understand. I think what Dr. Walcott did for us tonight is to retrace over 300, 400 years of structural racism and the impact that it's had on our Black males' mental health. And so we can look at it from a historic, psychological psychotherapy perspective and say that these are structures that are put in place to cause some of the things that we're experiencing now. We can look at it from a religious perspective and say that these are generational curses that have evolved over time. Either way we take a look at it, these are things that affect us, that if we don't address, and I like the fact that Dr. Walker shared about the community response that they're taking towards mental health, and not necessarily an individual perspective. Because for so long, when we look at issues around mental health, mental health therapy, that we think that the individual needs to go seek attention, needs to go seek help. And what I heard tonight is that we're discovering that that alone is not working, that it has to be a community impact, because it is a community issue. Come on in, Geoffrey. Come on in, Carla. I think you're muted, Carla.
Well, actually, I would ask the Reverend S. Perkins about this, because one of the things that come off very problematic is in a lot of the Western approaches to therapy, because most of the theoretics focus on this issue of non what do you call it, atheoretical, that you don't look at what has happened to the person, which doesn't work for our people. And that's Frantz Fanon had a big problem with it, because Frantz Fanon said, how can you talk about a man who is having a depression, who's suffering, and you don't then recognize that this man has been living in depraved housing conditions for the past 2 generations, because his family has been oppressed, because he lives in a state that doesn't recognize his skin color as being valid. And then you're going to say, oh, he's depressed because he's not coping with how life is, because he didn't develop ego strength. That's what is always the challenge, because you have to look at the context that we live in. You have to look at the impact. And they talk about generational curses. We look at intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
Because people have gone through things, and we're just recognizing that our genetic code carries behavioral responses. So we're now seeing that you are looking at intergenerational trauma that's going to land, that has to be broken. So I will ask Dr. Carla to talk about that, because that's what she's seeing when she speaks to these guys.
And I love the fact, right before you come in, Carla, I love the fact, the way that you put it, Dr. Walcott, that, we need to shift from asking what's wrong with you to what has happened to you, right? And that is a very different perspective. That when we shift that question to say, okay, what's wrong with you? No, what has happened to you? It gives us a more communal experience. Come on in, Reverend Carla.
So Dr. Walcott, totally on point. What I will say that resonated with me as you shared your presentation is what you described. I see on a regular basis when I talk to patients in private practice, especially those who have recognized that they have been through some things, those adverse childhood experiences, they have been through trauma, and they're trying to make sense of how do I restructure my life going forward so that I don't have to continue feeling like I'm living in these patterns, and I don't have to replicate it in my own family. But particularly when I work in school settings, what you have described around the issues with responding appropriately to authority, a lot of the interpersonal challenges, especially as young people are beginning to date and have romantic interactions, we are doing a lot more talking around teen dating violence, regardless of whatever sexual orientation students may express. A lot of that type of aggression and some lack of clarity around what it means to be in a relationship and what those control aspects look like. And really trying to teach all of these socio-emotional skills in an appropriate manner, while dealing with the demands of a system that requires children and adolescents to sit down, be quiet, and learn something. And many students cannot learn because they are constantly stimulated by all that they have experienced in home, in the school setting, because school is not a safe place for everybody, in communities where we know, just like you described, there's a lot of community violence that's happening. So you cannot expect, especially after 2 years of a pandemic now, that children will return to the school setting and we have the same children and adolescents that we had from 5 years ago, because things, unfortunately, I don't want to say that they've gotten worse, but I will say they have become more pronounced, because that time away from the norms and settings has really unleashed some things and loosened some of the boundaries that may have been more consistent when we were frequently more in person.
Thank you, First Lady, for that. I want to ask a question to both of you. Dr. Walcott, you brought this up in your presentation. The question is for us to really kind of talk through the most critical intervention points for Black males' mental health. You talk about this age between 16 and 25. Can we explore that a little bit? And from you, Dr. Walcott, from more of a brain development perspective, and for you, Reverend Carla, can we talk about it from a emotional development perspective?
Right. So one of the things that happens is that as you're moving from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, your ability to make proper judgment calls is based on your brain's ability to process information. And you process information through bringing in all the input, getting it to your basic primal emotional centers, and you get feelings about it. And then it goes to the front part of your brain that says, listen, I know you feel this way, but this is the appropriate response within this time and within this place. And you have to weigh the consequences with the rewards. And so you have to put things in perspective. That part of your brain does not fully become developed until age 20 to 25. And in most areas, they recognize that, which is why you have these laws that protect kids from 18 and 21, no drinking, no this, no that. But something very peculiar happens, and you can go from all the news reports and all the things. For young Black men at the age of 13, 14, and 15 who make a mistake, who act out that is in a way that is in keeping with their brain development because they don't have the societal and the family structures to prevent them from doing that, the response is usually very excessive. The response is that these people are adults. These people should know better. And they are children. They are actual children. But you lack the presumption of childhood. And that a lot of our young Black men go through that in the societies like North America, like Canada, like most of the post-colonial societies where you have entrenched white populations there. And it's the norm because you can see it in the criminal justice system. And we have to understand and allow for the fact that brain development doesn't occur until 2025. So if a child is coming from a home where there's poor supervision, that child is going to have behavioral issues that need to be addressed by somewhere else, whether it be a therapeutic setting, whether it be a community setting, whether it be the church, because the church in most instances have been the saving grace for a lot of these kids with their youth group formation. Because it's not going to, in our country, we have the police youth group, but you can see the discrepancy in that if you are going to have police youth groups in areas like Chicago or in New York, it doesn't come across. So youth rescue units and using sports. Sports is probably one of the most critical things to capture young people and young people's attention because it gives them all the things that they require. It gives them focus, it gives them purpose, and it gives them a sense of accomplishment. And so we have to use what is there. Having them sit down in a therapeutic session to talk about how they felt about their mother at age 6 or whether or not they were potty trained at the right time is not useful to our population because it's pointless and it doesn't resonate with the actual reality that our people go through.
Thank you for that. First Lady, come on in. Talk to us about some of the emotional things that you see for that age group.
Definitely just echoing what Dr. Walcott has said in terms of impulsivity is high because, again, the places where those decisions get made, it's not fully developed. And what I often find is a lot of adults, even though we're trained, quote unquote, to work with young people, we are not always there. So we do not understand how to engage, particularly our Black and brown male students. We do not always know how to engage them. And it really takes engagement, and it takes being willing to model the appropriate response, because if something happens, a simple thing, I give you an instruction and you don't follow it, and I go from 0 to 60 and you're just like whoever, and you all in the audience know what this might look like because many of us have seen it. Some of us have done it at times. That is going to trigger a less than pro-social response. It is not going to trigger the response that causes any type of dialogue to happen, any type of reflection to happen. And I think that it often shows up in ways in which our young people, particularly our young men, are not going to show us their vulnerability because, like Dr. Walcott said, there are so many demands placed on them and so many messages that are basically suggesting that you don't fit here, wherever here is. So we have to really understand that some of those emotional responses come from a place of young people trying to figure out who are they and who do they want to be versus what they see society has told them that they are, or that some of us inadvertently might have told them that they are.
Thank you, First Lady. This discussion has really pushed me. We've been doing this series, Dr. Walcott, over the last, let's say, 8 months. We started back in the summer, late summer of last year, with a Sunday morning. So we've done these on Sunday mornings during our worship service. So we've had this kind of discussion instead of a preached word, because it's that important to us, and it's a captured audience. It's a captive audience. But this discussion has pushed me a bit because we have spent some time kind of thinking about offering individual counseling to members of our community that might need it. And what this discussion has done for me is to say, well, maybe that's not the complete answer. Maybe we need a more community-based response to what's going on, because we might hit some of the issues with individual counseling, but a more community-based response might be what's needed. And so thank you for this conversation, because even as I've been thinking about this over the last this series for us kind of birthed at the beginning of the pandemic when we were home, and saying this is going to impact our community more than we know it, right? The COVID-19, being isolated, being separated, not being able to engage in community in ways in which we have done before is going to impact us. And so that's how we started this discussion. I do have a question, and I see some questions that are coming in. Thank you, Sister Tanya Buford, all the way from Raleigh, North Carolina. Thank you. Males have been comfortable to be vulnerable, don't they? I'm trying to understand that question, Sister Tanya, before I put it up on the screen. But thank you for that. I do have a question, and I'm going to pop it up right on the screen for both of you. And it's, what are some successful treatment types of Black men, both traditional and innovative? And I think we have discussed this, but I want to pull this out for our audience that are joining us. What are some of the treatments that's out there? If a brother's watching right now, whether they are in Rwanda or in Ghana, or they're in St. Croix or Jamaica, or they're watching from Indianapolis or from Miami, Florida, what are some of the innovative treatment types that are available for Black and brown men as we're talking about mental health?
All right. So I spoke about one initiative that we've been using earlier, which is really community-based, and it's group-based, because as you said, if you're going to do individual one-on-one treatment, it's going to take forever to get to the core of the problem. What we use is a group-based initiative that's based on sociodrama principles. And we use that discussion. It's really the concept of community heal thyself, by getting the people together and providing a safe space. And the arts, especially the creative arts, are a huge fulcrum for safe space activity, because it allows expression of ideas and thoughts that would otherwise be traumatic or difficult in a space that people can process it. And we use the creative art therapies to help the group to struggle and resolve issues, and then are able to translate it. Paulo Freire did similar work in the pedagogy of the oppressed in Brazil. There's a dear brother of mine from Brazil, Vitor Perdue, that is working with severe mental illness using theater as a therapeutic modality. And the theater, I do a course in summer at McGill with Professor Jaswan Guza, who's a phenomenal child psychiatrist, who looks at art and healing. And the use of art-based therapies are more reflective and resonate more with our people, because art is one of the initial focus of health and wellness. Art was initially a part of the ritual of healing. It is only in the contemporary era that art has been relegated to the business of entertainment. Art is not entertainment. Art is communication and healing. And so the art and healing program that we do, we look at different methodologies that have been working, and they actually help to bring out the business of expression, of catharsis, of processing of trauma. A lot of these art-based healing therapies are out there, and they're non-conventional, and different people have brought them into different spheres, and they're adaptable. So you can use one that fits you best. Building support groups, support systems. I spoke about Dixon Chaibanda, who is my brother from Zimbabwe, who's been doing phenomenal work by training grandmothers on how to provide supportive psychotherapy for persons dealing with depression, especially women with depression. We tend to miss the postpartum depressive issues. Mm-hmm. So it's about a community-based approach, not necessarily a specialist-based approach. It's about empowering the people who have contact with the group that needs help and giving them the tools to work together to be able to meet the needs of the population.
Thank you. First Lady, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I was just also going to say that in a lot of the groups that I'm part of with other clinicians that are clinicians of color, we have had quite a renewed emphasis and focus during this time on emotional freedom techniques and other types of mind-body treatment. So one of the things, two treatments that are of great interest to me are EMDR, which kind of focuses on mind-body connection and interrupting the, if you will, the neural pathway between some of the distress you might have experienced in a particular experience and really helping a person work through that, because trauma doesn't just happen to people and they remember it. They hold it in their bodies, right? Brain spotting is another technique that a lot of clinicians of color are also focusing in on, because again, like Dr. Walcott, you highlighted, there is a concerted effort to really move away from only Western ways of diagnoses and looking at what is wrong as opposed to what has happened, and how do we help people integrate. There are even many community-based, like going to barbershops and different things that have popped up across major cities in the US, and really them trying to understand how to make those avenues more accessible, because the treatment has to come where people are and where people are naturally gathered, as opposed to always expecting individuals to go someplace. And which is one of the reasons why in schools, we should really be able to do some of this, but it requires a larger understanding of the system and recognizing that if we don't address this, the learning that happens or doesn't happen really won't have the impact we think it's going to have in 2 to 4 years, because the same young people that leave with their diploma in 4 years, they're going to have the same issues that they had through school. But when they get in that post-secondary environment, they won't have the same safeguard, and it can end poorly for them.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Reverend Carla. We're coming to the final turn on this, and Bethel know me enough. We're only taking one corner today. I do have, I guess I'm going to start with a statement, and it might end up in a question. I shared on Sunday, Dr. Walcott, when I was sharing with my congregation that you will be on. I said, I shared with them my own personal story, right, of my youngest brother. At the age of 15 or 16, had a psychotic break. Like he just broke, and at that time became schizophrenic, and I've been struggling with this for the last 12 or 15 years, needing to be medicated on a monthly basis, right? And so I share that with the congregation, having watched what was, and I still believe that of all my father's children, he's he's the smartest one. But I watched him struggle with mental health over the last 12, 15 years. What happens when medicine is needed, when medication is needed? right? How do we navigate that path between the community-based or the individual-based psychotherapy versus medication that's needed to help somebody to be able to at least have some kind of a normalcy in their life?
Okay. Well, I think one of the things that